On this day, the 12th of December, 1937, the USS Panay is torpedoed, sunk, and then strafed by Japanese forces during the evacuation from Nanking. Up to this time, in China in 1937, a war had existed between the Empire of Japan and the nationalist Chinese forces since 1936. The Japanese forces had won much easier in Shanghai than the Japanese had thought, and they decided to march on the Chinese capital, Nanking, modern Nanjing, but in the old way we say Nanking, the southern capital. Now, Chiang Kai-shek was the leader of nationalist China, and he had, just before this, brought China together. For a couple of years, China had stabilized, the warlords had been put down, the communists had been put in their place, they'd had their long march. He was just about getting China together again when the Japanese invaded. At Shanghai, there were massacres, and in Nanking, well, it became known as the Rape of Nanking. Up to 200,000 Chinese people in and around the city were killed over the weeks that the rape went on. 20,000 Chinese women were raped, including the elderly and infants. It was a brutal sacking of a city, made worse by the fact that Chiang Kai-shek at first had resisted the Japanese advance on his capital city. But after 2 days of vicious fighting, they realized they had to abandon the city. They pulled out, and the remaining forces fell apart. Many of the Chinese soldiers, they took off their uniforms and tried to blend in to the civilian population. This was going to be disastrous for the civilians of Nanking. As I said, 200,000 killed, and they weren't just killed, they were brutally murdered and mutilated, alive or dead. This was seen and witnessed by much of the world's press who were in Nanking, it being the capital of China. And throughout the world, there was genuine shock and disgust at what was happening. But not only did they target Chinese people, they also were sneakily targeting other powers that they didn't really have much time for. They saw as enemies. The United States and Britain, especially. A British steamship called the Lady Bird was shelled. The American consul in Nanking was slapped around the face by a Japanese soldier. And the USS Panay, a river gunboat, which was trying to rescue civilians in Nanking and bring them upriver, as well as family members of Americans living in Nanking and people they knew. They were evacuating from Nanking along with a lot of other boats. They had told the Japanese that they were in the area. They had American flags up, 3 of them apparently. Yet still the Japanese launched 2 torpedoes from airplanes. Once the ship was sinking, they then came around again and started strafing the boat and the survivors as they were trying to get out of the boat. And they were also doing this to other vessels in the river at the time. So 3 people died immediately on the boats. but it's not known just how many died around the boats. There were probably dozens, if not hundreds. This came out, and the Americans were outraged, not just by this, but by the American consul who'd been slapped and humiliated by a Japanese soldier. And it's almost as if some within the Japanese army were trying to goad the United States into a war at that point. So this was years before Pearl Harbor and the attack on Everywhere that happened on the 8th of December 1941. And it's almost like there was an instinct or a desire within the military. They knew they had to fight America. They had to drive America out of Asia and the West out of Asia. And this was just something that ran through all the ranks. Now, the Americans, obviously, at the time, they were outraged, but the Japanese apologized and they said it was a mistake, and the Americans accepted it and they left it at that. It kind of died down. But after the attacks on Pearl Harbor and the war with Japan, this became a bit of a propaganda thing, talking about this is what the Japanese role was like. This is what they've been trying to do from the beginning. So, and it does seem that there was something about it. There was something odd about this incident. It's like they're trying. So, the Rape of Nanking was an awful event, but it spread out from that city as people were trying to flee for their lives. The Japanese were sinking ships full of refugees and then strafing them afterwards. So pretty brutal altogether. Okay, so if you like these videos, come back tomorrow for more. Subscribe, comment, and like.